Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, FinCEN, that great data dump of how the world's biggest banks have allegedly allowed criminals to move dirty money around the world. An investigation by the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, revealing the role of global financial institutions in what the ICIJ calls industrial-scale money laundering, and the suffering that flows in its wake, particularly in Africa. We'll speak to the Washington-based journalist who coordinated the international investigation relating to African businesses and individuals. And later, the sky is not the limit. The American Space Force deploys to a vast new frontier, the Arabian Desert. It's the 6th independent U.S. military service branch tasked with missions and operations in the rapidly evolving space domain. But they're not in space, so what are they doing on Earth? We'll speak to our correspondent who's across the space warfare branch of the U.S. Armed Forces. Coming up. So this week, a major financial story. Leaked documents have revealed how British and international banks across the world, including Africa, helped criminals and money launderers to move apparently dirty money around the globe. The documents show how banks failed to stop these transactions even when they suspected them. Known as FinCEN files, they're being shared by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. It's the first time the public have been able to see how banks deal with crime and suspicious financial behavior. The documents that were leaked are called suspicious activity reports, and they are what banks send to the authorities if they think clients may be doing something financially dodgy or shadowy. But then, having submitted the reports, more often than not, they end up doing nothing. We'll speak to one of the ICIJ investigators in a moment. But first, here's a brief look at how money is often laundered through major banks and cities across the world, courtesy of the ICIJ.
A crime boss, let's call him Ivan, has made a fortune from international cocaine deals. He wants to make it look like the money came from a legitimate source, so he can freely spend it. Ivan establishes a shell company in Latvia that claims to own a chain of coffee shops, and another company in Dubai that pretends to supply coffee beans. He opens an account for each company at regional banks. He knows they won't ask too many questions. The Dubai company invoices the bogus coffee shops for $600,000 worth of beans. The two regional banks can't directly transact with each other. Each has an account with a US-based correspondent bank, intermediaries that allow banks across the globe to process payments in US dollars. The big banks help process the dollar payments for the fake beans. US banks move trillions for regional banks around the world each day. Most of the time, they simply zip the money along to its final destination. But the bank handling Ivan's transfer flags it as suspicious. It may decide to A. Freeze or reverse the transaction and return the transfer fee, or B. Report the transfer as suspicious to US regulators, send the money to Dubai, and collect the fee. The US bank handling Ivan's payment sent the cash and then told US authorities about it. Option B appears to be very popular. In 2019, US financial institutions filed more than 2 million suspicious activity reports. Failure to file a SAR can expose banks to fines or penalties.
Well, to help shed more light on these FinCEN files and how Africa fits into the picture. I'm joined now from Washington by Will Fitzgibbon, who coordinated the ICIJ investigation relating to Africa. Will, thank you very much indeed for joining us. And just tell us how you carried out your investigations in Africa. I understand the ICIJ worked with many African journalists to uncover these sorts of transactions that were investigated.
That's right, Charles. ICIJ is a non-profit organisation in Washington, DC, and what we specialise in doing is coordinating and bringing together different journalists. So when ICIJ received or was shared these FinCEN files from BuzzFeed News in America, who initially obtained them, one of my big jobs was to contact and liaise with journalists in African countries and ask them if they were willing to participate in this investigation. Obviously, it's not easy. Not all journalists can do this. We worked on these very detailed, complex documents for at least 1 year, trying to uncover complex financial flows. And in the end, we at ICIJ worked with a global team of 400 journalists, and that included journalists from at least 20 African countries.
And these FinCEN files, I mean, there's 2,500, I understand, of these documents. What did you find with regard to Africa?
That's right. We're talking about thousands of these so-called suspicious activity reports. And as your very useful segment earlier mentioned, that's a tiny fraction of the millions of suspicious activity reports filed each year. When it comes to Africa, we journalists were initially struck by some of the huge African names included in these documents. We're talking about former Nigerian Vice President Atiku Abubakar and some of his wives. We're talking about the husband of Angolan billionaire Isabel dos Santos, former DRC Vice President Jean-Pierre Bemba, former head of World Athletics Lamine Diack. These are individuals whose names come up in these suspicious activity reports in relation to transactions that banks themselves believe bear potential hallmarks of wrongdoing, and submitted those concerns to banking regulators in the United States.
But let's just be clear, Will, that these are suspicion of illegal activities, that there is no evidence that they were in fact illegal.
That's right. It's very important to remember that a suspicious activity report is not in any way proof or evidence of wrongdoing. These documents are often shared with, say, the Federal Bureau of Investigation or with police, who can then use that information to conduct subsequent probes. But the documents in and of themselves do not evidence wrongdoing. What we do know, however, is that many of these transactions and documents are subsequently used in criminal cases or convictions. Only last week, your listeners might be aware that Lamine Diack and his son were convicted of corruption-related offences in France related to alleged bribery and corruption as part of World Athletics. And those files and those transfers we see within FinCEN files. We see strange transactions that experts tell us make very little sense. Millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars within the space of maybe 48 hours going to 3 different countries. Money pinging across the world in ways that bankers themselves scratch their heads about.
And let's just be a little more specific, if you don't mind. Obviously, you've mentioned, a lot of interesting names of African people on those sort of FinCEN files. Can you mention those names and what they were actually suspected of doing?
Let's take the case of the Abubakar family in Nigeria, for example, Charles. In that case, banks drafted and submitted a suspicious activity report a number of years ago when a bank noticed a transaction from one of former Vice President Abubakar's wives. The bank transaction seemed to involve a purchase of a property in Dubai, but the bank, in its report, noted the long and detailed history of allegations against Mr. Abubakar himself. Your listeners may be very familiar with those. Obviously, Mr. Abubakar denies wrongdoing and has never been charged or convicted in relation to those allegations, but those allegations are available online Let's remember again, it's not proof or evidence of wrongdoing, but I think the average reader, the average listener out there would be right or justified in asking questions about why a Nigerian politician and his family, for example, are using so-called offshore companies, trusts in Guernsey, for example, with money moving around the world from Nigeria to the United States and then into Dubai. Let's remember that these documents we're seeing are ones that journalists and members of the public were never meant to see. These are secretive, minute details of transactions that relate to some of the most important people in the world. And as investigative journalists, I firmly believe that transparency when it comes to public figures is a central part of what we do. And this is one example.
So, Will, what happened after these alleged suspicious activities were flagged up? I mean, were there further investigations that were carried out either by the regulators or the banks themselves?
Unfortunately, Charles, that's not something that we can really know. As you could imagine, investigators and regulators were very uncomfortable responding to journalists about these. So in most cases, we can't know what happened after a suspicious activity report was filed. I thought you made an important point earlier, and it's one of the central points of the FinCEN files, which in investigation, which is what experts and the response to our project has shown, which is the money laundering or the anti-money laundering system globally is broken. Time and time again, the FinCEN files shows that banks make these suspicious activity reports. They tell US authorities that something looks suspicious, but it's a little too late, isn't it? When suspicious money or money that a few months or a few years later is actually shown to be dirty money, there's something fundamentally wrong, I think, when that money has been moved rather than having been stopped in the first place. And we've seen in the United States and in countries like Liberia already today that regulators and officials are calling on wholesale reforms to the anti-money laundering system so that more dirty money can be stopped in its tracks rather than allowed to circle throughout the world and ultimately cause harm to average men and women around the globe.
Well, absolutely. And I'm just wondering, Will, whether you actually made contact with these people who were flagged up as engaging in alleged suspicious activities. I mean, did you try to reach them for Atiku Abubakar, for instance, to try to put your findings to him and get his reaction and his side of the story?
Charles, that's a hugely important role of investigative journalists. Never trust a journalist who doesn't contact the subject of their investigation. We at ICIJ and our partners spend weeks trying to engage in an attempt of an open discussion with these people. I myself contacted the spokesman for Mr. Abubakar a number of times via phone, via email, and I know that our partners at Premium Times in Nigeria did also. Unfortunately, the spokesman declined or did not respond to our requests for comment. But our approach is very much to detail all questions, all statements of fact, because we as journalists want to know the other side of the story too. Unfortunately, we can't control who responds to us or when, and it perhaps won't surprise your listeners that in most cases, individuals contacted by investigative journalists don't respond. Mr. Jean-Pierre Bemba, for example, in the DRC, he did reply to us. Others did not.
Okay, Will, do stay with us. Would like to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about how criminals allegedly use the global financial system to move about $2 trillion of dirty money around the world. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Onyegolu. Now, leaked documents have revealed how banks in Britain, Africa, and across the world have allegedly helped criminals and money launderers. The secret banking report shows how major banks have failed to stop crime even when they suspect it. They showed that London is a major hub for money laundering, with billions of dollars of suspected dirty money moving through the financial system. The documents, known as the FinCEN files, have been shared publicly by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Correspondents say the leak is unprecedented because the documents show how banks have been dealing with crime and suspect behavior. And with me from Washington, Will Fitzgibbon, who coordinated the ICIJ investigation relating to Africa. Thank you for staying with us, Will, and I'll come to you in a moment, but we have a press release from the Atiku Abubakar family that I'd just like to read. It's headlined, "Atiku family not under surveillance, have not breached any laws," and these are recycled false allegations. And it reads thus: "My attention," that's his spokesperson, "has been drawn to recycled and regurgitated lies about the person of Atiku Abubakar. For the avoidance of doubt, Atiku Abubakar is not under any US watch list, neither has he been charged or will ever be charged by the United States Justice Department or any other in a foreign jurisdiction." And that's really the meat and potatoes of what they're saying. That so it reads further that it will be recalled that these recycled lies, according to the press release, were re-unearthed just before the 2019 presidential election in Nigeria. And to put paid to them, Atiku Abubakar applied for and received a US visa, whereupon he embarked on a visit to the United States in January 2019, and he stayed at a hotel just miles from the United States Department of Justice. But anyway, that's what they're saying, I suppose, in response to this new report. But let's move on from there. And I understand you said you worked with journalists in Nigeria from, for instance, the Premium Times newspaper. What was the nature of the work that they did for you or with you?
ICIJ has a long-standing relationship with the Premium Times. We've worked with them on our other huge global projects your listeners might remember, such as the Panama Papers and Swiss Leaks. ICIJ's model, Charles, is one of cross-border collaboration. That means that it's the journalists in each country who take the lead on reporting and investigating. So I might be a coordinator here based in Washington, DC, but understandably, the real experts, the true investigators here, are journalists at the Premium Time newsroom and at many other African newsrooms that we work with. That's what our model is, and that's why it works. It recognizes that foreign correspondents don't have the expertise, nor do they know how to best tell the story that will resonate in a local context.
And of course, Will, there were also issues and suspicious activities emerging from Ghana to do with revelations around the gold industry there. I mean, tell us about that, if you will. I understand there were suspicious transactions running into tens of millions of dollars.
The gold industry emerged as quite a strong theme within the files, Charles. There was particular focus by a number of reports on a Dubai-based refinery that, according to investigations by ICIJ and colleagues, was previously under investigation in the United States for potential financial crimes. That was dropped and no charges laid. But what we found working with reporters in Ghana, in Liberia, and Benin was that banks reported transactions related to the gold trade there, as you say correctly, to the tune of tens of millions of dollars in some cases. Once again, those transactions aren't necessarily or even proven to be criminal or evidence of wrongdoing, but it's very important, as your listeners will know, in these countries where gold is a huge natural resource, but I think many of us will recognize hasn't necessarily led to wealth or richness within these countries where the gold comes from. It's an industry that traditionally has been shrouded in secrecy. It's hard to know where the gold comes from, who these middlemen or women traders are, and ultimately how it gets to a place like Dubai or to Switzerland.
And Will, I guess what stands out from your investigations, your being the ICIJ investigations, is that often many of these transactions aren't actually known at all to local regulators, particularly in Africa, but take place apparently under the radar. I mean, how much of a difference have your revelations made to that?
I think that's a very important point, and once again speaks to the broken nature of the global system designed to combat anti-money laundering. How can Liberian authorities or how can Ghanaian authorities adequately fight money laundering if they're not even aware of $50 million or $100 million leaving their country, passing through banks in the United States, and then ultimately arriving in somewhere in the Middle East? A number of officials that we spoke to before publication and who've responded subsequently to these ICIJ FinCEN files revelations have said, yes, we had no idea this kind of money was leaving our country, and no one has shared with us information to the extent of that. And I think experts tell us at ICIJ that increased information sharing globally is an important step in cleaning up the system.
And also, Will, an astonishing story out of Tanzania, where apparently a transaction of more than $600 million took place with a company that no one could establish whether or not it ever actually existed. I mean, tell us about that.
This was quite a remarkable case. As you say, the significant US bank did a transaction or a series of transactions totaling, I believe, $620 million. It involved a so-called company in Tanzania that the US bank and the local banks were not able to identify. We worked with an investigative reporter in Tanzania who spent months speaking to banking officials, speaking to regulators, visiting the corporate registry, and even door knocking on the address of this so-called company, only to find that it was in a residential building owned or occupied, I believe, by a Chinese national who claimed to have nothing to do with this company. I think it's a good example of just how terrifyingly opaque the financial system can be. How is it possible that some of the world's biggest banks are giving a green light to a company that is not known to be registered either in the country of origin or known to the banks that are helping $620 million move around the globe?
And I mean, I'm sure you're aware of this, Will, but the ICIJ report, when it came out yesterday, had a huge effect on the share prices of very big international banks. I mean, HSBC fell to a 25-year low. The Hong Kong and I think Hang Seng Banking Corporation has also seen dramatic falls. I mean, its shares are now worth only half of what it was a year ago. I mean, does that suggest that your investigations are having an impact?
I think so, Charles. I think it does show that the FinCEN files revelations of the systemic and global nature of money laundering and how brand name household banks are failing to stop it really did echo with individuals, with shareholders, and with these corporations. Let's remember, these aren't new allegations. A bank like HSBC has been fined significantly, I believe, even more than $800 million in the past few years for having allegedly helped South American and Mexican drug dealers move money around the globe. And yet the FinCEN files show that despite that fine, despite HSBC's promises to do better, that other dirty transactions continued to be moved through that bank. And I think what we see in the share prices effect, temporary as it may be, is that people have sat up and paid attention to these latest revelations.
Okay, well, please stay with us. We'd just like to talk to you a little bit more before we let you go. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about how allegedly money is filtered through the global financial system to move trillions of dollars of dirty money around the world. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Now, another huge revelation about funds that are being moved around the world's banking system illegally. The latest investigation is called the FinCEN Files. Reporters from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists worked with journalists in Africa and around the world to show how trillions of dollars have flowed illegally through some of the world's biggest banks. The details have been revealed in a mass leak of confidential documents. They consist of more than 2,500 files used to report suspicious behavior. And the ICIJ worked with many African journalists to investigate and uncover financial activities that seem to point to money laundering and corruption globally. And Will Fitzgibbon, who coordinated the ICIJ investigation relating to Africa, is still with me from Washington. Thank you very much indeed, Will, for staying with us and your patience. And just before we went on a break, we talked about the share price of these big banks like HSBC, I think Standard Chartered as well, and all the rest of it. What about the reputation of these banks that have been implicated? I mean, I've heard it said that these so-called scandals are now just business as usual, whether it's the Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, I mean, yours, the ICIJ, is the FinCEN. There's also the Swiss files. I mean, it's just going to be greeted with what one analyst called consumer apathy, and no one is ever going to believe that the bankers are working in anybody's interest but their own, and nobody believes that governments are regulating things beyond what is necessary for self-protection. So, I mean, how do you get the general public to care about these things?
It's a good question, and as journalists, we can only do our jobs by putting the facts out there for public consumption. It's not up to us to then determine how politicians or even members of the public react or respond. I think promisingly we have seen a few signs and noises from politicians in different countries, senators in the United States, members of parliament in the European Union, who've said that they do want to look at the issue, that they do want reforms to be made to legislation concerning anti-money laundering. And I think revelations like this will continue. The system clearly is broken, as many experts tell us, and as the FinCEN files show us. And journalists will continue to report on these matters, even if, as I'm sure you will have seen, and I've certainly seen, there are some people on social media, for example, who do often accuse us of recycling old information. This is not the case. This is information, and these are stories that actually matter. I think that's important to convey. This isn't just about bankers doing bad things. This isn't just about men and women wearing suits and ties in New York, in London, and in Lagos. We find in the FinCEN files, for example, financial details of people who've been convicted of and sentenced to jail for helping import drugs into the United States. And we reporters track down families of people who've died from overdoses on those drugs. And that kind of drug movement around the world, quite simply, couldn't happen if dirty money and secretive money flows weren't allowed to happen. So, Charles, this isn't an abstract notion. Real average human beings are harmed and sometimes even killed because money is allowed to be laundered through the global system. And that in and of itself, I think is enough of a reason why we as reporters should and will continue to expose when it happens.
So really, I mean, Will, the challenge is to some extent, just going beyond the, what you're saying there, the challenge is to get the person on the street to actually greet this with anything other than cynicism and resignation, because, I mean, until the public are outraged, businesses won't change and governments won't regulate, more strictly. So to that extent, is the onus on the media, people like yourself and people in the media and possibly the regulators, to engage the public and help them understand that the damage is being done to their communities?
I think that's exactly right. As journalists, as investigative reporters, we've spent a year on this project. We're always thinking about how can we not only convey this important information, but how can we present it or package it in a way that is going to resonate with people who might not wake up every morning and think about banks or think about something like money laundering. We as journalists think and work very hard to try and present this information in a way that will resonate. We don't always get it right, but I think the FinCEN files, the way in which we connect money laundering to real people, we connect it to well-known public officials is part of that. And then also having the opportunity to speak with you in such detail is also a way in which the discussion can continue.
Well, I mean, we're very happy that you also took the time to talk to us. So would you say that, in a sense, the big banks are getting off scot-free here? I mean, they've had, drops in their shares and so on, and they've also been fined quite a lot of money. But I mean, the average person on the street believes they're getting off scot-free because, I mean, people have become so cynical because there have been so many of these scandals and those banks are still standing. I mean, wasn't there a time when a scandal like this would possibly cause a bank to go bust?
You're right that many experts we spoke to and people who've responded to the FinCEN files have said that the current cycle in which banks and scandals exist needs to change. That current cycle is one in which a scandal emerges, a bank is slapped on the wrist, made to pay a fine, and then the world moves on, needs to end. Many people we spoke to, including very senior US officials, prosecutors around the world, they've said, for example, that banks need to be held criminally liable, that perhaps individual senior officials within banks need to be held criminally liable. Many people tell us, well, it can't be the case that a huge bank like HSBC or JP Morgan is publicly on the record as having helped facilitate criminal activity, and then within a year or two, the CEO, for example, is able to take home a multi-million-dollar pay packet. Many experts we've spoken to said that in order to fix the system, one obvious step is to hold banks and bankers criminally accountable.
Well, that's an interesting point because, I mean, confirming what you're saying, nobody ever appears to go to prison. I mean, nobody gets charged, and the fines are laughable when you think about the scale of the monies involved. I mean, your investigation showed something like $2 trillion. I mean, so there's a huge gap between the interest groups or journalists, such as your consortium, who are passionate about this wrongdoing, and the general public who neither understand it nor care, really.
I think there is a gap. You're right there. These are complicated issues to understand. There's a reason why it took us more than 1 year to publish the FinCEN files. It's because these suspicious activity reports, these transactions don't make immediate sense to someone like me. But I think what investigative journalists do, and one of our central roles, is to put information out there objectively and factually. It's not always the case that investigative journalism overnight leads to impact. It's not always the case that someone exposed by an investigative journalist will resign immediately. Sometimes that can take a day, sometimes that can take 4 years. If you think about the Panama Papers, which happened 4 years ago, only yesterday in the United States did the first American go to jail for crimes revealed through that expose. What I would say to people is, don't lose hope when in journalism or in important public issues, when you don't see immediate reform. Continue to engage with the issues, because we as investigative journalists will still be there reporting on them.
And Will, at the risk of making you repeat yourself, I don't know, you might have touched on this earlier, but what's been the response of the banks involved? I understand they made various statements and so on.
Charles, banks are legally precluded from responding in detail. These suspicious activity reports are highly legally sensitive, so banks haven't been able to, or declined to in many cases, respond to specific examples. That said, banks also took the opportunity not to respond to many questions they could have responded to. All these banks have pretty much said to ICIJ that the matters exposed by FinCEN files are historic, that banks have improved their compliance or their anti-money laundering efforts, and that they're committed members of a responsible financial system. I think we as journalists always engage with banks. Some of these banks we send 50 or 100 detailed questions to, and I think it's always the case, unfortunately, that responses are shorter or less detailed than we would like.
Why do you think your report affected their share price?
It's hard to say, and share prices move for a number of reasons. That's certainly the case on the New York Stock Exchange, for example, yesterday. Look, I think that is one of the powerful elements of a consortium of journalists. The FinCEN Files is not one reporter in the United States publishing a story about banks allegedly facilitating money laundering. FinCEN Files involved more than 400 reporters in 90 countries reporting on banks allegedly involved in the facilitation of money laundering. And I think once you reach that critical mass, the model of cross-border collaborative journalism really becomes a phenomenon that even banks in their ivory towers in financial capitals around the world cannot ignore. And that's one reason why I'm proud to work at ICIJ and proud to work with groups like the Premium Times, because together our force as investigative journalists can be much more powerful than an individual reporter.
So, Will, what needs to happen now? I mean, you've done your investigations, you've revealed the enormous scale of the movement of this alleged dirty money. What do you hope will come of all that?
It's not really my place to have hopes in terms of what will happen. I'll keep doing my job. I have more stories about the FinCEN Files to come out. I know that other reporters have more stories to come out. We also want to work with more journalists across different countries in Africa to make sure that every important story gets told. I think the debate has well and truly started. We've seen that in reactions by politicians in multiple countries. I, as a reporter, I'm always hopeful that insiders, that whistleblowers, that victims, that anyone with knowledge of any part of what the FinCEN Files reveals will get in touch, because we as reporters are here to keep telling these stories. I don't work on an investigation for a year just so I can forget about it within 24 hours and move on to something else. The FinCEN Files reveals that the broken anti-money laundering system around the world is a huge issue of global importance and of importance to average people's lives. And I think that, therefore, makes it incumbent upon journalists to continue digging into this, no matter how hard it is, and no matter how slow and sometimes frustrating it is that reforms don't happen immediately.
And I mean, Will, you mentioned that sometimes people's lives have been threatened. I mean, I was reading through your files on the ICIJ's website, and I mean, people have actually died or been killed as a result of this. I mean, do you feel sometimes that your life is at risk, or the colleagues you work with? We've got about 30 seconds.
I'm very lucky here in the United States to work as a journalist, but I am also lucky to work with very courageous journalists in countries like Senegal, Liberia, Niger, who I know during the FinCEN Files investigation have been threatened by individuals they have tried to report on. Once again, I think that we as journalists are safer in numbers, and that's why collaboration is how ICIJ works on a project like the FinCEN Files.
Will, I want to thank you very much indeed for joining us from Washington. Will Fitzgibbon is a journalist who coordinated the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists investigation into the FinCEN Files, and he coordinated the part of it that related to Africa. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including the American Space Force tasked with missions and operations in the rapidly evolving space domain deploys to a vast new frontier. Stay with us.